Hello, Sioux City fans. Welcome to this Sioux City history, 1910 to 1920. This is a part of our series of Sioux City history through the decades. I really want to thank you for joining me here today, and I hope you enjoy the show. Let's give us a little context, so we're not just jumping into Sioux City history right away in 1910. So the era from 1840 to 1857 is a pioneer era for Sioux City. This is when the first people of European extraction are beginning to move into the area that would become Sioux City. And of course, in this era, we also see the founding of Sioux City at its platting by John Cook in 1854, 1855. That pioneer era is followed by Sioux City's incorporation in 1857, and this era lasts up to about 1868 with the arrival of the railroad. This era is defined by a constant growth in Sioux City in population from around 100 people up to about 4,000 people at the arrival of the railroad. And this era is also dominated by steamboat traffic on the Missouri River. And we become a primary excursion point for expeditions into the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming. The next era of Sioux City history is really that post-railroad arrival from 1868 up to 1886. Now this is an era where railroads are being built throughout Sioux City's tributary territory into the Dakotas, in Minnesota, in northern Nebraska. This is an era where we see Sioux City's population rise from about 4,000 people, nearly quadrupling to 19,000 people in 1886. We see the rise of manufacturing. We also see the rise of agriculture in Iowa, in this corner of Iowa. The era of 1886 to 1893 is really Sioux City's boom era. This is when Sioux City really takes off as a modern U.S. city. To see more on this, please see our video, Sioux City in the 1890s. Of course, the boom era is followed by a depression era. So from 1893 to 1900, after a panic in 1893, Sioux City is reeling from the effects of this. Sioux City's population, which had been about 60,000 in 1893, dropped to 28,000 in 1895, but rebounds again in 1900 to about 33,000 people. Again, see that same video, Sioux City in the 1890s. The era from 1900 to 1910 is an era of rebuilding. Sioux City's population climbs from 33,000 to about 47,000 people. And again, just take a look at the video. I did that one, so it's probably pretty good. So, saying that, what will define the era in Sioux City from the era of 1910 to 1920 in Sioux City? Let's take a look and find out. So, in 1910, Sioux City was Iowa's second largest city with 47,000 residents. Sioux City was Iowa's largest meat processing center, handling 1.1 million animals or so. That made it the 5th in the nation. Sioux City was Iowa's largest livestock market, handling over 1.6 million animals. That also was the 5th in the nation. Sioux City was Iowa's largest manufacturing center, doing about $40 million in business. Sioux City was Iowa's largest wholesaling center, with about $50 million in business. Sioux City was Iowa's largest railroad center, with 6 trunk lines, 5 of them having terminal facilities here. Sioux City was an important banking center. It had reserve city status, 15 banks, and an annual transaction of $151 million. One of Sioux City's major industries was the meat industry. So let's take a look what was going on with those businesses. From 1910 to 1920, the number of animals received at the stockyards increased 250%. In that same time frame, the number of animals received at the packing houses also increased 190%. From 1914 to 1920, $1.6 million in building permits were issued for infrastructure in the Sioux City stockyards. Of those projects in the stockyards included an addition to Cudahy Packing in 1910. Now, Cudahy was Sioux City's largest employer in this era with about 2,000 to 2,500 employees. The Sioux City Serum Company started in 1912. Now, that company was the largest anti-hog cholera manufacturer. And Sioux City, with 5 of these anti-hog cholera companies, was the nation's second largest producer of this serum after Kansas City, Missouri. Armour and Company, the city's second largest employer, had a couple of additions between 1913 and 1918. You can see those in this Sanborn map image. Those are the portions in the center of the image that are in orange. An addition was made to the Sioux City Livestock Exchange building. You can see that here. That was in 1915. The Rudolph Herney Packing Company also had an addition in 1916. You can see that is the structure on the far left of the screen. Now, Herney closed in 1917, but Swift & Company, which had had a buying presence in Sioux City for nearly 20 years at this point, took over operations and began their first slaughterhouse in Sioux City. The Sioux City Stockyards Company built a reinforced double-decker hog shed in 1916. Many of you might remember this and its affectionate name, Hog Hotel. A local firm, the Midland Packing Company, began in 1920. Midland opened in January but closed in May of 1920. They had oversold stock, and there was an inadequate amount of capital to continue operating this packing plant. Let's move on to other manufacturing and industry. From 1910 to 1920, the value of manufacturing in Sioux City increased from $40 million to $175 million. From 1910 to 1920, the number of businesses manufacturing goods increased from 163 to 349. From 1910 to 1920, the number of employees in manufacturing increased from 4,300 to nearly 12,000. So let's take a look at some of these new and expanding manufacturing facilities. The Sioux City Bakery at 813 West 7th began in 1911. Keeping in the baking business, Johnson Biscuit Company moved into a new factory in 1912 at 5th and Wall Streets. Wall Street is today Floyd Boulevard. The Campbell Baking Company started in 1919 and built this factory at 915 Grandview Boulevard. In the early 1920s, this was Iowa's largest bakery. The Western Newspaper Union opened an outlet in Sioux City in 1911. The building you see here was built in 1912 at 5th and Virginia Streets. The brick industry had been a staple of Sioux City's economy since the 1850s, but there's consolidation in this industry. Clay Products Company was incorporated to operate the Sioux Paving Brick Company, the Lower Brick Company, and the Holman Brick Company in 1911. Clay Products Company, operating those 3 brickyards, merged with Sioux City Brick and Tile, which had its own 2 brickyards. That merger happened in 1911. So here we have 5 of Sioux City's 6 brickyards under one management. Clay Products Company was renamed Sioux City Brick and Tile in 1913. Sioux City Brick and Tile then purchased the Sergeant Bluff plant of the L.J. Haskins Brick Company in 1914. Now at the bottom of the screen you can see the Holman Brick Company in Sergeant Bluff, and on the right you can see Sioux City Brick and Tile Company, plant number 2 in South Riverside. Tom Green, who had been an officer with Sioux City Brick and Tile, was ousted from that company, so he and his wife began a new brickyard in 1915 at 4200 Correctionville Road. Another major industry in Sioux City was that of creameries and dairies. The Hanford Produce Company, which had come to Sioux City in 1894, had an addition which you can see in the foreground. That was built in 1912. This facility was located at 1st and Court Streets. Hanford was actually the world's largest creamery. Keeping in the dairy business, we have Blue Valley Creamery Company. They'd been in Sioux City since 1907, but added the top 2 floors to this building in 1914. They were located at 2nd and Pearl Streets. Roberts Dairy Company, which was a chain, opened a location in Sioux City in 1918 at 809 Douglas Street. Fairmont Creamery, also a chain, opened its largest facility in Sioux City in 1919 at 2nd and Park Street. This was also the nation's largest poultry dressing company. McCracken Machinery Company started in 1912 at 9th and Division Streets. Here you see an interior of their factory. Now McCracken made machines that made concrete pipe. The national retail chain, F.W. Woolworth Company, opened in Sioux City in 1912. This is their location at 417 4th Street. Philip Bernard Company, which made agricultural equipment, started in Sioux City in 1912. They built a factory you see here at 2300 Floyd River Road in 1918. Just as a note, Floyd River Road is today Hawkeye Drive. The Houston Pen Company started in 1912 and is located at 406 Pierce Street. I do get a kick out of these advertisements. A little baby pen. Also manufacturing pens was the General Manufacturing Company, which started in Sioux City in 1919 and built this factory at West 5th and Sioux Streets. C.T. Hopper & Company, which had been a Sioux City manufacturer and wholesaler since 1883, built a new factory in 1913, which you can see here in the foreground, and then the 5-story structure in the center was built in 1915. These are located at 1st and Virginia Streets. The Wetmore Tractor Company started in Sioux City in 1913. They built the factory you can see here at 119 Main Street in 1920. The American Popcorn Company came to Sioux City in 1914. Here you can see some of their corn cribs in Leeds. Now, the American Popcorn Company in this time was the nation's largest popcorn distribution company. This, you can see in the corner, their box, which is patented 1918. Albertson & Company started in Sioux City in 1914. You can see here their first factory at 1st and Jennings on the lower left. They built a new factory on Floyd Boulevard in 1920. Now, they were primarily manufacturing automobile tools and other tools for the automobile industry. Speaking of automobiles, in the 19-teens, we see the automobile revolution. So, in 1900, there were no automobiles in Sioux City. But by 1910, there were 3 dealerships and 9 auto-related businesses. That number explodes by 1920, where we have 52 dealerships, 93 automobile supply businesses, 19 automobile repair shops, and 7 businesses making automobiles or automobile parts. Iowa itself had the largest per capita automobile ownership in the nation. There was 1 vehicle for every 6.2 people. So in Iowa, there were 390,000 vehicles. You can see Nebraska and South Dakota were not far behind. The Hawkeye Truck Company started in 1914 and built this factory at 27 Hawkeye Drive in 1918. William Warnock opened a new tank factory in 1915 at 100 Mill Street. In case you don't know where Mill Street is, this was just south of the Battery Building, or today's Hard Rock Hotel and Casino. The Sienna Cigar Company started in 1915. This is their factory in the early 1920s at 1114 5th Street. Martin's and Kettle's Milling Company started in 1915. They were operating a mill that had actually been in place since 1867. This image also shows a new grain elevator on the far left that was built in 1919. These structures were located at 11th and Steuben Streets. Talking more about Sioux City's grain industry, the Flanley Grain Company and Terminal Grain Company built new elevators in 1919 at 14th and Terminal Drive. There were 7 grain elevator facilities built in Sioux City between 1915 and 1920, and the building permits for those accounted to over $500,000. The Mystic Milling Company in Leeds and the Western Terminal Grain Elevator Company built new grain facilities in 1919. So Sioux City emerged as a grain market, and the Board of Trade here was established in 1907. By 1920, Sioux City was the fastest growing grain market in the U.S. and boasted 6 grain mills and storage for over 2 million bushels. The Bierman Engraving Company started in 1915 and moved into this building at 5th and Douglas Streets in 1916. Fairway Manufacturing Company, which made agricultural implements, started in 1916 and moved into this factory in Riverside in 1919. It had been the former Liberty Cartridge Company, and this building would also later serve Sacred Heart Catholic Church. The H.A. Baker Company, which had been a textile manufacturer in Sioux City since 1892, moved into this new building in 1917 at 5th and Jones Streets. The Steam Tractor Auto and Manufacturing Company built this building in 1917 at 219 West 7th Street. And here's one of their brands, the Carbon O Piston Rings. I just love that advertisement. The Sioux City Tire and Manufacturing Company started in 1918. They were located at 5th and Plymouth Streets. Plymouth Street is today Lewis Boulevard, or Business Highway 75. This is today where the Sioux Honey Association is located. Thompson Yards Incorporated, a lumber company and coal company, moved to a new location at 2209 4th Street in 1918. Chesterman and Company, which had moved to Sioux City in 1885 and started bottling Coca-Cola in 1904, built a new factory at 305 Bluff Street in 1920. Hydrastone Products Company was a manufacturer of concrete ornaments and concrete blocks. They started in Sioux City in 1920, located at 2222 3rd Street. Nelson Brothers Poultry Company opened a location in Sioux City in 1920. This is located at West 1st and Isabella Streets in the former home of the Interstate Brewing Company. J.C. Renison and Company, which had operated greenhouses in Sioux City since the early 1880s, opened a massive new complex of greenhouses in far eastern Morningside in 1920. Rob Ross Company started in 1920. They were located in a building at 304 Wall Street, which again is today Floyd Boulevard. This was a food manufacturing business developed by Tollerton and Warfield Wholesale Grocery Company. Let's take a moment to look at Sioux City's rail industry. New facilities were being added here, including with the Great Northern Railroad shops being built in 1917 at 18th and Lewis Boulevard. Also in North Riverside, the Milwaukee Railroad built new shops in 1918. And in downtown, the Chicago Northwestern Railroad built a new freight house in 1919. This building was over 3 blocks long and located on the south side of 3rd Street between Jackson and Virginia Streets. Moving on to wholesaling, one of Sioux City's major industries. From 1912 to 1920, the wholesale business in Sioux City increased in value from $50 million to $207 million. In that same era, the number of wholesalers increased from 70 to 318. From 1912 to 1920, the number of people employed by the wholesale houses grew from 850 to nearly 4,600. Crane and Company, which had been in Sioux City for a couple of decades, opened a new warehouse in 1911 at 3rd and Jackson Streets. Hornick-Moore Porterfield, which had had a presence in Sioux City since the 1860s, added on to their warehouse in 1911. The addition is the 4-story section you can see on the left. They were located at 304 to 310 Pearl Street. The Hanson Glass and Paint Company built a new warehouse in 1913 at 504 Douglas Street. Palmer Fruit Company started in 1914 and built this warehouse at 208 Pearl Street. It's worth mentioning at this point that Palmer and Company split into 2 separate businesses in 1914, the Palmer Fruit Company and the Palmer Candy Company. William Tackaberry had been a wholesale grocer in Sioux City since the 1870s. He opened a new warehouse in 1916 at 3rd and Wall Streets. Haley Neely Company, which was a wholesale fruit business, built a new warehouse in 1916 at 3rd and Jackson Streets. Wigman Company, wholesaler of plumbing supplies, started in 1916 and moved into this structure where they're still located at 317 Perry Street. The Isaac Miller Company started in 1916 and was located at 2318 3rd Street. Tollerton and Warfield Company started the Council Oak system of grocery stores in 1916. This was a relatively new concept. You can see here depicted a Council Oak store on Pierce Street. William Warnock, whose idea it was to start the grocery store system based out of their warehouse. The Council Oak is their catalog, and you can see the Tollerton Warfield warehouse at the corner of 3rd and Nebraska Street there on the right of the screen. Now moving on to growth and new building in downtown. This is the commercial block, built in 1910, located at 505 Pierce Street. Davidson Department Store, which had started in the 1880s, built 2 large additions to their store in 1910 and 1911. The 1910 section would be on the right side of your screen. The 1911 section is on the far left-hand side of the screen. In all, those additions to their building at 4th and Pierce Streets totaled over 80,000 square feet of new space. The Martin Department Store, not wanting to be left behind, put a new facade on their building in 1911. This is their store at 515 to 521 4th Street. The Davidson brothers were active in real estate and built the Davidson Auto Block in 1912 at 6th and Nebraska Streets. The Hotel Jackson at 5th and Jackson, makes sense, opened in 1912. That's a lot of Jacksons. Well, it's 2. The Howard Hotel, seen here, had additions built in 1912 and 1918. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen, the 4-story section was built in 1912, and the top 2 floors were built in 1918. The Hotel Howard was located at 3rd and Nebraska Streets. The Bennett Motor Mart was built in 1912 at 6th and Nebraska Streets. The G.H. Jenkinson Building was built in 1912 at the southwest corner of 5th and Pearl. The Lindholm Furniture Company moved to a new location in 1913 at 412 6th Street. The Martin Hotel was built in 1913 and had an addition of a 7th floor and an 8th floor in the back of the building in 1918. Of course, this structure is located at 4th and Pierce Streets. What made this building possible was the Mondayman fire in January of 1912, where the Martin Hotel had been a location of a hotel since 1870. The Davidson Building at 6th and Pierce Streets was built in 1913. In 1914, the Bolton Brown Block fire at 4th and Nebraska Streets resulted in a collapse of the facade of this building and killed firefighters Frank Fulton and Celie Lawton. But the fire did make way for a new Bolton Brown Block in 1914, which you can see here at the southeast corner of 4th and Nebraska Streets. The Webster Building, built in 1915, was located at 5th and Jackson. The Elks Club built a new clubhouse in 1915 at 8th and Douglas. The Sioux City Journal moved into a new building in 1915. It was located at 5th and Douglas Streets. Now, of course, the move to this location was made possible by the Lindholm fire. The Lindholm Furniture Company had been on that location since 1894, but the fire destroyed their building. Hence, you saw a new building of theirs just a couple minutes ago that was built in 1913. The Trimble Block was built in 1915 at 6th and Pierce Streets. This structure is today the home of Security National Bank. The Francis Building was built by the Martin Estate in 1915 at 5th and Pierce Streets. That site had previously been occupied by the Sioux City Grain Exchange, but a fire there in 1914 made way for the new Francis Building. The Wetmore Building at 615 Douglas Street was built in 1917. H.A. Wetmore had come to Sioux City in 1908. He started selling automobiles here. He also began manufacturing tractors in Sioux City in 1913. And he was the lone Sioux Cityan to race in the 1914 Sioux City 300 auto race. Hint, hint, we'll get there in a little bit. Kresge built a structure here in Sioux City in 1917 at 4th and Pierce Streets. The McGraw Building was remodeled in 1917. Here you can see its location at 515 5th Street. The Princess Theater was built in 1917 at 412 Jackson Street. This is the Lessenich Building, built in 1917 at 5th and Pearl Streets. This was the early home of the Motor Mart for the Barish Motor Company. The Grain Exchange Building was built by the Davidson Realty Company in 1917 at 7th and Pierce Streets. And yes, I know the photograph shows it as the Insurance Exchange, which it became shortly after it was the Grain Exchange. The Martin Estate also built the Capitol Theater in 1918 at 412 Nebraska Street. Here you can see an architectural drawing of that structure. The Davidson Brothers Company, which had the real estate company and the department store, built this annex to their department store in 1918 and 1920. This was located at 312 Douglas Street. Perhaps the crowning achievement of architecture during the 19-teens was the completion of a new Woodbury County courthouse in 1918, located at 7th and Douglas Streets. The Schoberg Motor Company built this structure in 1919 at 13th and Pierce Streets. Many of you will remember this as a longtime home of the Sioux City School District Administration Building. Here's an image of the Davidson Realty Company Auto School, built in 1919, located at 8th and Nebraska Streets. The William Warnock Company built the Warnock Building as a motor mart in 1919 at 7th and Douglas Streets. As an interesting note, W.A. Klinger was William Warnock's son-in-law, and this was W.A. Klinger's first construction project in Sioux City. The T.S. Martin and Company built a new department store in 1919 at 4th and Nebraska Streets. And the Woodbury Building was built in 1920 at 3rd and Iowa Streets. Let's move out of downtown and take a look at some of our neighborhoods with new schools, hospitals, churches, and all sorts of other institutional buildings. St. Boniface Catholic Church built their new church building in 1911 at West 5th and Omaha Streets. A new main library opened in 1912. It was located at 6th and Jackson Streets. Joy Elementary School in Morningside opened in 1912 and was added on to in 1914, located at 3409 Indiana Avenue. A new main hall was built on the Morningside College campus in 1912. It had to be rebuilt after an April of 1912 fire. In Riverside, the Commercial Men's Boat Club built a new structure in 1913 after a fire had destroyed their previous facility. Trinity High School started in 1913 and built their main building, which you can see on the left, in 1913, and a dormitory, Garrigan Hall, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. These were located at 33rd and Floyd River Road. Sioux City High School had an addition put on in 1913. This is at 13th and Nebraska Streets. Going back to the Morningside College campus, the Alumni Gymnasium was built in 1914. On the west side, Whitfield Methodist Church built a new structure in 1914 at West 5th and Rebecca Streets. In Riverside, Riverview Elementary School was built in 1914. This is located at Wright Avenue and Bryant Street. Now this is what we call the first modern school. Now, just a brief bit about what a modern school is. Basically, this is a school which is built out of fireproof materials. Restrooms are moved from outdoors indoors. Basements are used for classrooms. It's essentially a modern school also with lighting coming through windows from a single direction. Now, this modern school movement was pioneered by Sioux City School Superintendent, who we're going to talk about right now. Melvin Green Clark came to Sioux City in 1911. Clark was born in New York in the 1860s. He attended various schools and completed his degrees in 1898. As I noted, he came to Sioux City in 1911 as superintendent of the Sioux City School District. He transformed school infrastructure by building and modernizing over 20 schools. He created the junior high school system in Sioux City. He wrote textbooks, developed curriculum, and modernized high school courses and vocational programs in the Sioux City schools. Speaking of that, he also started a new Sioux City normal school that is, teacher training. Just taking a look at what was going on also within the Sioux City Independent School District, between 1910 and 1920, 7 new schools were built. Between 1910 and 1920, 15 schools were added on to. Between 1914 and 1920, building permits for school projects totaled almost $800,000. Now on the bottom of the screen you can see Everett Elementary School on Rebecca Street. The addition is in 1916 is on the right-hand side of that image. Now on the right-hand side of the screen, Whittier Elementary School in Morningside, the addition on that, built in 1919, is on the left side of that image. On the west side, the Hillside Sanatorium began in 1915. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, in the background, is their new structure built in 1919. This is located at the corner of West Street and West 19th. In the East Bottoms, Annunciation Catholic Church opened in 1915 at 8th and Chamber Streets. This was a largely Italian congregation. On the north side, First Methodist Church built a new structure in 1915 at 19th and Nebraska Streets. In 1916, the Holy Resurrection Orthodox Church, which was largely composed of Russian immigrants, opened. St. Thomas, another Orthodox church with a largely Syrian congregation, started in 1918, and Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church opened in 1918. On the bottom of the screen, you can see Holy Trinity's original home at 522 Jennings Street, the same location they are today. And here's also the original St. Thomas building at 722 Iowa Street. St. Casimir Church, whose congregation was largely of Lithuanian immigrants, was organized in 1914. They built this new church in 1916 at Leach Avenue and South Lynn Street. Just as an interesting note about the immigration patterns that were coming to Sioux City, between 1910 and 1920, more than 770 families from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as the Middle East, applied for U.S. naturalization in Woodbury County. The National Business Training School moved into a new building in 1916, which you can see here at 7th and Nebraska Streets. The Chesler Deaconess Hall built a new building in 1917 at 1308 Nebraska Street. East Junior High School opened in 1917 and had an addition in 1919. Now this building is at 1520 Morningside Avenue, and this building was also Sioux City's first junior high school. The Woodbury County Poor Farm had a new main hall built in 1917. This is southeast of Sioux City a little ways on Old Highway 141. St. Joseph Hospital had a new nurses' home built in 1917. This is at 21st and Court Streets. Also in 1917, St. Vincent Hospital moved into a new building at 7th and Jones Streets. The congregation of First Congregational Church built a new building at 13th and Nebraska Street in 1918. Their previous home, which was only 26 years old, had burned in a fire in 1916. But continuing on a little bit with First Congregational Church, let's talk about one of its pastors, Wallace M. Short. Short was born in Iowa in 1866. He attended Amity College, Beloit College, and Yale University Seminary. He came to Sioux City in 1910 to serve as pastor at First Congregational Church. However, his anti-prohibition and pro-labor position resulted in his forced resignation in 1914. He was elected mayor in 1918 and re-elected 2 more times. He was popular because of his strong support of labor unions and progressive politics. Even though this is not in the 19 teens, he was later elected to the Iowa House and ran unsuccessfully for governor in 1934, 1936, and 1938. On the north side, the maternity hospital built a new structure in 1918 at 28th and Iowa Streets. West Junior High School opened in 1918 and had additions in 1920. It was located at West 5th and Myrtle Streets. First Baptist Church, which had been in Sioux City since 1850s, built a new building in 1919 at 9th and Douglas Streets. Trinity Lutheran Church, which had started in 1885, built this new building in 1919 at 12th and Jackson Streets. The Lutheran Hospital on the north side was added on to in 1919. This was located at 27th and Pierce Streets. It's also worth noting that the Lutheran Hospital built a new nurses' home in 1916. St. Monica's home was built in 1920 at 43rd Street and Perry Creek Road. Perry Creek Road is today Hamilton Boulevard. Crescent Park Elementary School was built in 1920 at 27th and Myrtle Streets. And lastly, Roosevelt Elementary School was built in 1920 at West 6th and Turner Streets. I want to stay in the neighborhoods a little bit longer and talk about some houses and apartments being built in this era. This is the Ben Schuline House at 2604 Jackson Street, built in 1913. Now this house was built by renowned Sioux City architect William Sts, who practiced largely in the Prairie School of Architecture. Now Prairie School is epitomized by its emphasis on horizontal, or fitting in with the prairie. You can see how that's exemplified in this house by the low-pitched roofs and the massive porch columns. This is just one Prairie School house we're going to look at. The John Kelly House at 2501 Jackson Street was built in 1913, and you can see it too has that low-pitched, hipped roof, very representative of the Prairie School movement. Because of the massive influx of people to Sioux City, there wasn't enough housing stock available, so there are many apartment buildings built in the 19-teens, including the Carroll Apartments built in 1914 at 11th and Jackson Streets. The Pilchard Apartments were built in 1915 at 1700 Morningside Avenue. New North Side neighborhoods are springing up, like along Summit Street. This is the R.Q. Rouse House at 2100 Summit Street, built in 1915. This image of the west side of Summit Street, just north of 18th, shows the A.A. Ashby House, the N.T. Hansen House, and the Carl Tennis House between 1807 and 1817 Summit Street. These houses were all built between 1916 and 1918. Moving a little farther north, we see the Jesse Nathsker House at 2415 McDonald Street, built in 1916. This house was located in the Heights neighborhood. Speaking of the Heights began in 1913 and was founded by Byron Kingsbury and Origen S. Dean. There was a desire for a high-class neighborhood with large building lots, winding boulevard, and picturesque traffic islands, never mind the fact that this real estate development was right next door to Grandview Park. This Garden City approach to urban design became popular in the United States and Great Britain after 1902. The Heights features diverse architecture from the city's three prominent architects, William Sts, Beutler and Arnold, and K.E. Westerland. Among that diverse architecture is one of Sioux City's finest examples of Prairie School architecture, the H.H. Everest House, built in 1917 at 37 McDonald Drive. The Smith Apartments at 18th and Nebraska Streets were built in 1917. The L.R. Tripp House at 3236 Jackson Street was built in 1918. Now, the reason I wanted to take a look at this house is because it's a great example of craftsman architecture. Now, craftsman architecture was popular between about 1905 and 1930, and elements of this design include exposed rafter tails. If you look below the eave lines, you can see the little rafter tails sticking out below the roof line. Also, the decorative brackets on the gable ends. Thousands of craftsman-style homes were built in Sioux City during the 19-teens. More apartment buildings were built. The Walsh and the Teefy-Bolstein apartments were both built in 1918 at the corner of 17th and Jackson. The Sioux apartments at 19th and Grandview Boulevard were built in 1919. Speaking of apartments, between 1914 and 1920, $1.2 million worth of building permits were issued. They include some of the images you see here, including in the upper left, the Grandview apartments. Below that, the Hawkinson apartments. Bottom center, the Johnson apartments. On the bottom right is the Nash, and on the top right are the Ida apartments at 19th and Pierce Streets. Let's take a look at some public property, parks, and even cemeteries. Stone Park became a city park in 1912. Now, of course, it has a long history going back to the 1880s when it was the farm of Daniel Hector Talbot. And later, after Talbot lost the park, lost his farmstead in the 1890s, it became the property of the Stone family, and the Stone family called it Minnewasika Park. Here you can see Richard Ricketts, longtime caretaker of both Talbot's farm and Stone Park, feeding zoo animals around 1915. Sunken Garden Park became a city park in 1915. Now, the feature of this park are, of course, the cinders that are leftover coal sludge from the Sioux City Cable Railway Company powerhouse. The Graceland Cemetery Mausoleum was built in 1917. Also, in Calvary Cemetery, their new mausoleum was built in 1917. Just as an anecdote, T.S. Martin, the guy we've talked a little bit about earlier on, well, he died in 1915 and was going to be buried in this mausoleum, but he couldn't be buried because it wasn't finished for another 2 years. So he was buried and eventually placed in this mausoleum. Gilman Park became a city park in 1918. You can see it depicted here in this image with ice skaters. 3 other parks in Sioux City began between 1910 and 1920. Ravine Park in South Morningside, it was also known as Garrettson. Anderson Park on the east side opened in 1919, and Lyons Park on the west side opened in 1919. Let's take a look at some events in entertainment, some things going on in this era besides all these building things I've been talking about. The Interstate Livestock Fair, which is the equivalent of a state fair, was active in Sioux City from 1903 to 1926. So certainly in our era between 1910 and 1920, it's quite active. Here you can see an image of the Midway. A new racetrack and grandstand were built in 1910 on the Interstate Fairgrounds. And because this is actually a livestock fair, a new swine barn was built in 1920 on the Interstate Fairgrounds. Former President Theodore Roosevelt was speaking at Mizzou Park on the 3rd of September 1910. The reason for his trip was to promote a Taft-era tariff. Other politicians, including Woodrow Wilson, campaigned in Sioux City. Here Wilson is speaking on the Morningside College campus on the 17th of September, 1912. Looking at technology, George R. Call received Sioux City's very first radio transmission in 1912. Now, we talked a little bit about the popularity and the rise of the automobile, while automobile races were also becoming popular between about 1911, when the first Indianapolis 500 was held, and 1914, when Sioux City Speedway held the 4th of July race. An audience of 47,000 witnessed Eddie Rickenbacker defeat favorite Barney Oldfield in the 300-mile race held in Stevens, South Dakota. Stevens today is North Sioux City. The 19-teens also saw the prohibition of alcohol. Iowa reinstated its prohibition effective the 1st of January 1916. Sioux City's two breweries, the Interstate Brewing Company, which you can see on the lower left, and the Sioux City Brewing Company, which you see on the lower right, closed. The teens were also a time of international conflict. Pancho Villa raided New Mexico in March of 1916, and 200 members of the company's H&L of the Iowa National Guard were mobilized. They spent 7 months guarding the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas. William Harding was a controversial political character in this era. He was the only Sioux Cityan to ever be elected governor, but we'll get to that in just a second. Harding was born in Iowa in 1877. He attended Morningside College and the University of South Dakota, where he earned his law degree in 1905. He began his career in law in Sioux City in 1906, and then in the House of Representatives from 1906 to 1912. He served as lieutenant governor from 1913 to 1917 and was elected to the governorship in 1916. Major campaign issues of that election were tax reform, prohibition, which Harding was against, women's suffrage, over which Harding had no formal opinion, and how to fund concrete paved roads. After the United States' entrance into World War I, Harding issued an unpopular language proclamation which forbade the speaking of foreign languages in public, and also on the telephone. That proclamation, along with the mismanaged pardon of a rapist amid allegations of bribery, alienated Harding's political base. He had no political career after 1920. The Great War, or World War I. United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917, and almost 5,000 Sioux City men and women answered the call to serve. Here you can see military training conducted on the front lawn of Sioux City High School. Here you can see the teaching of semaphore and radio communication. Both Sioux City High School and Morningside College added military training during World War I. Here you can see digging of trenches at Camp Eaton on the Interstate Fairgrounds. The fairground served as a training ground for World War I enlistees. Coming to a close, the rough disaster of the 29th of June, 1918. While undergoing modernization, the 55-year-old Hedges block collapsed and broke into flames, killing 19 people. This was the greatest disaster in terms of loss of life in Sioux City history until the crash of United Flight 232 in 1989. After the disaster, the ensuing coroner's jury placed blame on the building's owner, the Western Iowa Company. This disaster also resulted in stricter building codes and professional architect F.E. Colby's appointment as Sioux City building inspector. We're just about to wrap up. I just had to share one of my favorite views of Sioux City, this aerial view from 1917, taken from the smokestack of the Sioux City Electric Light Works, overlooking downtown. We're looking off to the northwest, and this is a great view from 1917. You can see the construction in the center of the Insurance Exchange building, and in the background you can also see the construction of the Woodbury County Courthouse. In the foreground you see the freight houses of the Chicago Northwestern and the Milwaukee Railroad. So wrapping up, taking a look at this impressive decade. In 1920, Sioux City was Iowa's second largest city with over 70,000 residents, and Sioux City was the 99th largest city in the United States. Sioux City was Iowa's largest meat processing center, still, with over 2 million in receipts. We had dropped a little bit. We were now the 6th largest in the nation. We were Iowa's largest livestock market, handling almost 4 million animals. That was 6th in the nation. Sioux City was Iowa's largest manufacturing center, doing a business of $175 million. Sioux City was Iowa's largest wholesaling center, doing over $200 million in business. Sioux City was Iowa's largest railroad center with 5 trunk lines, all 5 of which having terminal facilities here. Sioux City was Iowa's largest grain milling and dairy center. Sioux City was Iowa's largest retail center and home to the state's largest department store, Davidson Brothers. Sioux City was home to the nation's largest creamery, the nation's largest popcorn distributor, the nation's largest hog serum producer, and the nation's largest poultry dressing company. Sioux City was an important banking center with reserve city status, 21 banks having a clearings of almost $550 million. Sioux City was the 44th largest banking center in the nation. Well, that was a lot, but thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoy this. I look forward to seeing your comments. So stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again someday. Bye, guys.